Marcus had always prided himself on being observant. It was a trait that served him well in his job as a freelance photographer, where the smallest details could make or break a shot. So when he noticed the mailbox at the corner of Elm and 3rd Street had shifted 3 inches to the left overnight, he paid attention. When Mrs. Henderson's rose bushes appeared slightly more withered than they had been the evening before, he made a mental note. But when he woke up on that Tuesday morning in October and discovered that his entire neighborhood had transformed into a landscape of crumbling ruins, observation became survival. The transformation was so complete, so impossible, that Marcus spent the first 10 minutes convinced he was still dreaming. He stood at his bedroom window, pressing his palms against the cool glass, staring out at what should have been Maple Grove Avenue. Instead, he saw broken concrete stretching into the distance, twisted metal beams jutting from collapsed foundations, and weeds growing through cracks in what remained of the sidewalks. The Henderson house, where just yesterday he had watched the elderly woman tending to her garden, was now nothing but a pile of rubble with a single wall standing precariously against the gray morning sky. His own house seemed to be the only structure left intact, an island of normalcy in an ocean of destruction. The walls around him were solid, the electricity still worked, and when he turned the faucet in his bathroom, clean water flowed freely. Yet beyond his front door lay a wasteland that belonged in a post-apocalyptic movie, not in the quiet suburban neighborhood where he had lived for the past 3 years. Marcus dressed quickly, his hands trembling as he pulled on jeans and a sweater. The rational part of his mind insisted this had to be some kind of elaborate prank or perhaps a film set constructed overnight, but as he stepped outside, the weight of reality settled heavily on his shoulders. The air tasted different, metallic and stale, carrying the scent of dust and decay. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant groaning of unstable structures settling further into ruin. He walked carefully through the debris, calling out names of neighbors he knew. Mrs. Henderson. Jim. Sarah. His voice echoed strangely in the empty space, seeming to bounce off invisible walls before fading into nothing. Where the Martinez family's house had stood, only a foundation remained, filled with murky water that reflected the overcast sky like a dark mirror. Marcus knelt beside it, peering into the depths, and for a moment he could have sworn he saw furniture beneath the surface. A dining room table set for 4, the chairs pushed back as if the family had just stepped away. The wrongness of it all pressed against his skull like a migraine. This was his neighborhood, the place where he jogged every morning, where he knew every crack in the sidewalk and every quirk of every house. He had photographed these streets countless times, capturing the changing seasons, the small dramas of suburban life. But now it was as if decades or perhaps centuries had passed in a single night, reducing everything familiar to ruins. As he continued his exploration, Marcus began to notice something else, something that made his skin crawl with an entirely different kind of unease. He was not alone among the ruins. Shapes moved in his peripheral vision, always just beyond direct sight. When he turned to look, there was nothing there, but the sensation of being watched never left him. It started as a subtle feeling, like the weight of unseen eyes, but gradually became more pronounced. Shadows seemed to shift independently of any light source, and the temperature would drop suddenly in random spots, creating pockets of cold that raised goosebumps on his arms. The first clear sighting happened near what had once been the elementary school playground. Marcus was carefully picking his way through the twisted remains of swing sets and jungle gyms when he saw her. A little girl in a yellow dress, standing motionless beside the rusted skeleton of a slide. She was perhaps 7 or 8 years old, with dark hair that hung limp around her pale face. What struck him most was how solid she appeared, how utterly real, except for the fact that she cast no shadow despite the weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. "Hello," Marcus called out, his voice hoarse from the dust. "Are you okay? Are you hurt?" The girl turned toward him, and Marcus felt his heart stop. Her eyes were completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible portion, like pools of ink set in her small face. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound emerged. Instead, she pointed behind him with one pale finger, and when Marcus spun around, he saw them. They were everywhere, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. Men, women, children, all standing silent among the ruins, all with those same terrifying black eyes. They wore clothes from different eras, some in modern dress, others in outfits that looked decades old. A woman in a 1950s house dress stood where the coffee shop used to be, her hands folded primly in front of her. A man in a business suit from the 1980s, his tie askew, leaned against a broken lamppost. Children in school uniforms from various decades clustered around what remained of the bus stop. None of them moved. They simply watched him with those void-like eyes, their faces expressionless, their bodies unnaturally still. Marcus realized he had stopped breathing and forced himself to take a shuddering gulp of air. When he looked back toward the playground, the little girl in the yellow dress was gone. He ran then, stumbling over debris, his heart pounding so hard he could hear it echoing in his ears. The watchers made no move to follow him, but he could feel their gazes tracking his movement, dozens of pairs of black eyes following his desperate flight back toward his house. He burst through his front door and slammed it behind him, pressing his back against the wood as if he could hold back the impossible world outside through sheer force of will. Inside his house, everything remained normal. The familiar furniture, the photographs he had taken over the years lining the walls, the coffee mug he had left on the kitchen counter the night before. Marcus sank into his favorite armchair and tried to make sense of what he had experienced. Hallucinations brought on by stress, perhaps, or a gas leak causing vivid dreams. But the sensory details had been too sharp, too consistent. He could still taste the metallic air, still feel the unnatural cold that had surrounded the watchers. As the day wore on, Marcus found himself unable to leave the house. Every time he approached a window, he could see them out there, standing motionless among the ruins, their dark eyes turned toward his home. They never came closer, never attempted to enter, but their presence was a constant weight on his consciousness. He tried calling for help, but his phone showed no signal, and when he checked his internet connection, there was nothing, as if the outside world had simply ceased to exist. Night fell with an abruptness that seemed unnatural, the gray sky darkening to black in what felt like minutes rather than hours. Marcus had not eaten all day, but the thought of food made his stomach turn. Instead, he sat in his living room with all the lights on, staring at the front door and listening for sounds that never came. The watchers were still out there, he knew, even though he could no longer see them through the windows. He could feel their presence like a pressure in the air, patient and eternal. Exhaustion finally overcame his fear, and Marcus dozed fitfully in his chair. His dreams were filled with images of the neighborhood as it used to be, bright and alive, children playing in yards while their parents watched from porches. But even in sleep, the dreams felt fragile, as if they might dissolve at any moment to reveal the ruins beneath. He woke to sunlight streaming through his living room windows and the sound of a lawnmower somewhere nearby. For a moment, Marcus remained perfectly still, afraid to look outside, afraid to discover what version of reality awaited him. Then, gathering his courage, he approached the window and peered out. Maple Grove Avenue stretched before him exactly as it should, lined with well-maintained houses, green lawns, and mature trees. Mrs. Henderson was in her garden, tending to her roses, which bloomed in vibrant shades of red and pink. The Martinez children were riding their bicycles on the sidewalk, their laughter carrying on the morning breeze. It was as if the previous day had been nothing more than an extraordinarily vivid nightmare. Marcus laughed with relief, pressing his forehead against the cool glass. Of course it had been a dream. The stress of his recent workload, combined with too much caffeine and too little sleep, had created the perfect conditions for such a realistic nightmare. He had heard of people experiencing false awakenings, dreams so vivid they seemed indistinguishable from reality. That had to be the explanation. He showered and dressed properly for the first time in what felt like days, then stepped outside to breathe the clean morning air. Everything was exactly as it should be. The familiar sounds of suburban life surrounded him, the comforting rhythm of normalcy restored. Marcus even waved to Mrs. Henderson, who smiled and waved back from her garden. But as he walked down the street, heading toward the coffee shop for his usual morning routine, Marcus began to notice small details that made his relief falter. The shadows cast by the houses and trees seemed darker than they should be, as if they were deeper, more substantial than mere absence of light. And though the neighborhood appeared normal, there was something off about the quality of light itself, as if you were seeing everything through a filter that made colors seem slightly muted, edges slightly softer. The coffee shop looked exactly as it always had, with its cheerful red awning and window boxes full of flowers. But when Marcus pushed open the door, the bell that should have chimed remained silent. Inside, the familiar layout was precisely as he remembered, yet something felt wrong. The barista, a young woman named Jenny whom he had spoken with dozens of times, stood behind the counter with a welcoming smile, but when she spoke, her voice seemed to come from very far away. "Good morning, Marcus." "The usual?" He nodded, watching her prepare his coffee with practiced efficiency. But as she worked, Marcus noticed that her movements were slightly too smooth, too perfect, lacking the small human imperfections that made actions feel natural. When she handed him the cup, their fingers brushed, and her skin was ice cold. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" Jenny said, her smile never wavering. But her eyes, Marcus realized with growing horror, were completely black. He backed away from the counter, the coffee cup slipping from his numb fingers to shatter on the floor. Jenny's smile remained fixed in place as she watched him, her head tilting slightly to one side like a curious bird. Around the coffee shop, other customers sat at their usual tables, reading newspapers and sipping their drinks, and every one of them had turned to look at him with those same black, empty eyes. Marcus ran from the shop, his heart hammering against his ribs. Outside, the neighborhood still looked normal, but now he could see the truth hidden beneath the facade. The shadows were too dark because they were holes, gaps in reality where the ruins showed through. The muted quality of the light was because none of it was real, just a projection over the wasteland he had discovered the day before. And the watchers were everywhere, wearing the faces of his neighbors, maintaining the illusion of normal life while those terrible black eyes tracked his every movement. Mrs. Henderson straightened from her roses, her kindly face transformed by the void where her eyes should have been. The Martinez children stopped their bicycles and stared at him, their young faces made monstrous by the darkness that had replaced their sight. Marcus stumbled back toward his house, the only place that still felt real, still felt safe. But as he reached his front door, he found someone waiting for him. A man in his 50s, wearing clothes Marcus recognized because he had seen them in old family photographs. The man had kind eyes, brown and warm and completely human, and when he smiled, it was with genuine affection. "Hello, son," the man said, and Marcus's world tilted on its axis. It was his father, who had been dead for 15 years. "Dad?" Marcus whispered, his voice breaking on the single syllable. "You're starting to understand, aren't you?" his father said gently. "You're beginning to see what this place really is." Marcus shook his head, backing away. "You're not real. None of this is real. It's a dream, or I'm having some kind of breakdown, or..." "You died, Marcus," his father said simply. 3 days ago. Heart attack in your sleep. Quick and painless, just like the doctors said mine was." The words hit Marcus like physical blows, but even as he wanted to deny them, pieces began falling into place. The strange quality of light, the way sounds seemed muffled, the fact that his house remained untouched while everything else crumbled. The watchers with their black eyes, standing eternal vigil among ruins that represented the decay of the physical world he had left behind. "The neighborhood isn't ruined," Marcus said slowly, understanding flooding through him. I'm seeing it the way the dead see the world of the living." His father nodded. "The watchers are like us, son. Souls who haven't moved on, for one reason or another. Some are recent, still learning to navigate this space between worlds. Others have been here so long they've forgotten they were ever alive. The black eyes are what happens when you stare too long into the void between life and death." "But you," Marcus said, looking at his father's familiar, beloved face, "your eyes are normal." "I haven't been here long," his father replied. "I came back when I felt you crossing over. I wanted to be here to help you understand, to make sure you didn't get lost like the others." Marcus looked around at the illusion of normalcy surrounding them, the false sunshine and the fake neighbors going through the motions of life. "How long do I have before I become like them?" That depends on you, his father said. Some souls let go quickly, moving on to whatever comes next. Others cling to the familiar, trying to maintain the illusion that they're still alive. Those are the ones who become watchers, standing guard over a world they can no longer truly be part of. As if to illustrate his words, Mrs. Henderson appeared at the edge of her garden, her black eyes fixed on them. She raised one hand in a greeting that might have been normal if not for the complete absence of life in her gaze. She had been maintaining her garden routine for who knew how long, trapped in the repetition of habits that no longer had meaning. Is there a way back? Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. His father's expression was infinitely compassionate. No, son. But there is a way forward. You just have to be willing to let go of what was and embrace what comes next. Marcus felt tears on his cheeks, though he wasn't sure the dead could truly cry. I'm scared, Dad.